You want to see something really cool? Check this out!
Gaming's move to the 5th generation was the most rapid the gaming industry has had to evolve in such a short amount of time, at least as far as I've seen within my lifetime. The shift to 3D meant developers had to relearn everything they knew about game design, as the third dimension added a literal and figurative layer of depth to every decision. Essentially, every rule there was about how to make a video game was being broken, out of necessity. Frankly, the things that worked so well for 2D games just didn't always work nearly as well when applied one-to-one to 3D. This Wild West period of game design meant that we were constantly getting games that were breaking the mold and taking risks in their attempts to establish a firm foundation in this new frontier of full 3D. Not all of these attempts were successful, but as this video series begins to approach the heyday of the original PlayStation, we'll be seeing a fairly hefty list of games that were true innovators in game design. In just the past 2 months, I've made videos about Resident Evil and Super Mario 64, two very different games that both paved the way for 3D gaming in their own revolutionary ways. And continuing through 1996, it doesn't take long for us to reach another trailblazer to the early 3D gaming scene, a game that arguably still has its fingerprints on modern games nearly 30 years later. Tomb Raider is a 3D action-adventure game clearly inspired by the likes of Indiana Jones. It stars a world-famous English archaeologist and thrill-seeker named Lara Croft, who is propositioned by business tycoon Jacqueline Natla to delve into the as-yet-unfound tombs of the ancient rulers of Atlantis. Seeking no payment other than the pure thrill of it all, Lara sets off to the mountains of Peru to begin her expedition. Tomb Raider sees the player, as Lara, exploring a series of large labyrinthine levels to gather items, locate keys, and solve puzzles as they delve deeper and deeper into the ruins of several ancient civilizations. Eventually, the setting moves from Peru to Greece and later to Egypt, treating the player to a variety of interesting scenery to not only bask in the beauty of, but even to climb atop and explore within. These ancient ruins also contain forms of dangerous wildlife that Lara will have to avoid or fend off, such as bears, panthers, and crocodiles, and even mummies and centaurs. The game consists of 15 total levels, with the general goal in each one being to locate and open the way to the exit using various keys scattered about. Lara has a fairly extensive moveset consisting of a variety of jumps and grabs, as well as the ability to swim. All of her basic moves can be taught to the player via a tutorial from the main menu, which is presented diegetically as a home tour. Lara also has access to several weapons, although most of them will have to be found as you go. She starts with nothing but a compass and a simple pair of pistols, which are fairly weak but have unlimited ammo. 3 more weapons can be found as the game progresses: a pair of magnums, a pair of Uzis, and a shotgun, all of which require the use of depletable ammo that can be picked up throughout each level. If you happen to miss a weapon when it first shows up, they'll continue to show up in later levels down the road, so you're never really out of luck when it comes to combat options. These weapons are what Lara uses to defend herself from the local wildlife she encounters, as well as a handful of human adversaries out to kill Lara and claim the ancient artifacts for themselves for their own nefarious purposes. Lara moves with a form of tank controls, with front and back running her forward or hopping her back, and left and right swiveling her in those directions when standing still, or gradually turning her in those directions when moving. She can jump in any of the 4 compass directions to perform flips, and her leaps can be done from a standstill or with a running start, which will affect their distance. She also has a pair of sidesteps, a tumble that acts as a quick 180-degree turn, and the ability to grab and hang from walls and ledges. The various caverns, cities, valleys, and tombs Lara explores can be scaled using her repertoire of jumps and grabs, and as long as the player holds down the walk button, they can prevent Lara from accidentally running off edges, allowing her to safely line up jumps, which is pretty vital here, as Lara will take fall damage or even die if she drops too far. The player is given basically no control over the camera. They can hold one of the shoulder buttons to switch to a first-person view to survey their immediate surroundings if need be, but doing so will plant Lara firmly in place. Otherwise, the camera switches between various presets, usually behind Lara's back, depending on where the player currently is. Every level features a handful of hazards or traps, and while some only cause minor damage, like wall-mounted darts or torches that light without warning, most of the traps in Tomb Raider can cause an instant game over. Rolling boulders, floor spikes, chomping blades, lava pits, all the classics. A handful of save crystals are scattered through each level at key points, which the player can use one time each. Completing each level also offers a save prompt, so the player can continue from wherever they left off, and any level the player has already completed can be selected again from the title screen. As we get further and further into 5th gen gaming, you'll probably hear me say this a lot, but when Tomb Raider came out in 1996, we had never really seen another game quite like it. And it's not like the game's concept hadn't been done before. It drew a lot from Prince of Persia, for instance, the original, not the remakes, as well as clear inspiration from classic films such as Indiana Jones. But 3D action games up to that point were almost always first-person affairs, like Doom or Kingsfield or even Quake, which came out the same year. Tomb Raider, though, was an entirely third-person affair, something that 3D games had rarely attempted. And if they did, it was usually in a format that used fixed cameras, like Resident Evil, or ones that only simulated full 3D via isometric angles. Sure, Mario 64 also came out in 1996, and even though most 3D action games after that point would ape that formula, it was a bold endeavor that only a company like Nintendo could have pulled off. Third-person 3D made character and camera movement far more complicated, which is why so many early devs never really tried to tackle it. Believe it or not, Tomb Raider and Mario 64 shared a lot of the same areas of discussion back in the day. The two being best-selling action games for rivaling consoles released around the same time inevitably brought comparison. But in truth, both games using a third-person perspective is really where the similarities between Tomb Raider and Mario 64 end. These games play very differently, and it just goes to show how diverse 3D gaming could be in those early experimental days. Both games are technically the same genre. They're both technically action platformers with wide-open level design, but the areas each game chooses to focus and expand on make them entirely separate experiences. For one, Tomb Raider stood out among other action games of the time due to its levels featuring uneven, natural-looking landscapes throughout. Most 3D games up to that point consisted of largely flat levels that maybe consisted of multiple floors, but there was never much thought put into creating variable, authentic terrain. Tomb Raider, right from the very first level, is consistently dotted with slopes, slants, crags, crevices, pillars, and plateaus. The player is constantly required to climb, shimmy, or vault over minor bumps or major obstacles, and this demonstrated another approach to 3D game design when compared to Mario 64. As wide open and built for platforming as Mario's first 3D outing was, the levels were still somewhat wide and accommodating, giving the player plenty of room to just run and jump to their heart's content. The way both these games handle the simple act of navigation within their massive levels is the biggest example of how the two contrast. Movement in Mario 64 feels freeing a lot of the time, and this was very intentional. That game was designed around Mario's movement, and the levels were built to bring out the full potential of his moveset in a way that gave the player a sense of agency and independence. Tomb Raider, though, feels like the opposite. It feels like the levels were designed first, and Lara's moveset was built for those levels. In fact, the game can feel damn near tile-based a lot of the time, and according to core design, levels were quite literally built on grids. Unlike Mario, Lara's jumps aren't directly affected by momentum. Her jumps always cover the exact same distance, and the only thing that makes a difference is whether that jump was from a standstill or with a running start. And Lara won't perform a running jump right away. She requires at least 2 full strides length before she'll actually leap. This means every jump in Tomb Raider is very deliberate, since they all require a certain amount of preparation, and the punishment for a single flubbed jump can be severe. Yeah, Mario also takes fall damage in his game, but no single fall will ever completely kill him. The most one can do is knock him down to 1 hit point. And the levels usually feature ample amounts of safety nets for the player as long as they stay away from the level's edges. Most of the bottomless pits are reserved for the game's later levels. But in Tomb Raider, I'm pretty sure there's only one level that doesn't feature any potentially lethal falls, that being the very first level. So one wrong move, one misaligned or misjudged jump can mean a game over, something that's even more devastating given the game's limited save points. Tomb Raider 2 would forego dedicated save points in favor of just letting the player save anywhere, and the PC port of Tomb Raider 1 did this as well, and while giving the player free access to save their game at any time is definitely a decision I understand from a quality of life standpoint, the more I play the original Tomb Raider, the more I come to actually appreciate the added challenge that strategic save point use provides. While most of the levels have fairly linear layouts and objectives, meaning save crystals act more or less as simple checkpoints, there are a good handful of levels that essentially act as giant puzzles, with the player often traveling back and forth through the same rooms over and over as they uncover new keys and open new paths, almost akin to a Metroidvania. These are the stages where the game design quirks provided by save points really show their potential. These more centralized level layouts can sometimes have 2 save points located just a few rooms away from each other, and so deciding how best to space these save points out itself becomes a part of the game's strategy, a similar sort of thing to the ink ribbon save system from the classic Resident Evil titles. And even in the more linear levels, falling victim to a bad jump or a devious trap and having to load up your most recent checkpoint means you're forced to actually deal with your own mistakes and learn as you go through repetition. You tend to memorize each segment of the level as a whole, instead of just save scumming before every potentially tricky bit, which, while obviously more time-consuming and sometimes frustrating, I think helps in the long run when it comes to learning and retaining effective traversal strategies. When the stakes are higher, you have to focus more. Learning the levels in Tomb Raider, in fact, became something of a mild obsession in the time I spent playing the game for this video. Now, I wasn't completely unfamiliar with Tomb Raider before this. I played and finished the game a handful of times over the last 5 years or so, but it had admittedly been a while, and so a lot of my playthrough here was me relearning the controls and the stages. With each game I play for this channel, while I try to experience as much of a game's content as I can, and go for 100% completion if I feel it's reasonable, I do still have a vague sort of timetable in place for how long I expect each game to last, so I can plan ahead and not fall behind on my upload schedule. Given the length of this game, I expected Tomb Raider to be a 4 or 5 day game at most, but it actually ended up being closer to a week and a half, as I found myself playing through each level around 3 times. The first time would be a basic blind playthrough just to reacquaint myself with each level and refresh my memory on the various objectives and hazards and puzzle solutions. The second would have me locating all of the level's items and secrets, the latter of which the game does keep track of on your end-level ranking screens, and the third, sometimes even fourth time through each level would have me trying to do all of that as efficiently as possible, or without dying, or without saving, or while trying to hunt down and kill every enemy. It goes on and on. I did all this not because I had to, or because you're rewarded with anything for doing so, but just because I wanted to, so clearly the game is doing something right. I think one more thing that drew so much comparison between Tomb Raider and Mario 64 was that both games featured main characters who, in their own right, were sort of treated as though they were real-life public figures. Mario is as much a celebrity as he is a video game character, and soon after the release of Tomb Raider, Lara Croft became one of the earliest examples of a virtual starlet. Years before Square would attempt to manufacture their own virtual celebrity via Aki Ross, the fine folks at Core Design ended up making one out of Lara completely by accident. Soon after the game's release, advertising for Tomb Raider and its sequels would place almost exclusive focus on its fetching female lead. Ironic, considering the game's publisher, Eidos, had lobbied hard to have a male character playable. But once Lara proved popular, Eidos went all in. Lara Croft was a star, with print ads that suggested gamers were building shrines to her in their homes, and TV ads that suggested that grown men would consider leaving their wives just for the opportunity to meet her.
Mom know about this?
Who?
Tomb Raider's sequels would proudly plaster Lara's name on the cover as though she was a big-name Hollywood actor. It seemed like every bit of marketing for these games revolved around how awesome and cool and hot their lead character was, which was unprecedented as far as video games go. For the first time, we had a popular video game mascot character who, in spite of awkward early 3D rendering, exaggerated proportions, and, inflated assets, actually kind of felt like they could be a real person. Seeing how much of an impact Lara Croft was having on their brand, Sony would be incredibly savvy in snatching up exclusive console rights to Tomb Raider sequels. And with how popular those Tomb Raider sequels would prove to be, and with how linked to the PlayStation branding the franchise would become, it's probably surprising to learn that the first Tomb Raider was actually a Saturn exclusive for the first few months. In fairness, this wasn't always the plan. The PlayStation, Saturn, and PC versions were all built simultaneously, and in fact the Saturn release being rushed out the door to uphold the deal with Sega means the Saturn version is actually the choppiest and buggiest of the three. Not that the other versions are without issues. The PlayStation version's frame rate really chugs in a few segments, particularly the flooded cistern level, and the PC version had its own unique hangups as well. And no matter which version you played, all of them suffered from a bug where the last collectible secret in the game's very last level won't ever be registered on your score screen for some reason. But the folks at Core seem to be in good spirits about one particular bug at least. There's one specific level that holds one specific item in one specific location that can only be reached by exploiting a bug. A true example of that old industry saying, it's not a bug, it's a feature. An N64 port of Tomb Raider was planned, but cancelled due to the exclusivity deal with Sony being signed and the fact that Nintendo just never sent Core any N64 dev kits. Their loss, I guess. Tomb Raider's combat was a big point of focus among the dev team at first, but eventually this was dialed back in favor of puzzle solving and death traps. Looking at how the combat works in the final game, I think I can see why their priorities shifted. To put it as kindly as I can, the combat in Tomb Raider is shoddy. The game does have a very generous auto-aim, and Lara does a great job at keeping a bead on her target as long as you hold the fire button down and keep her pointed vaguely in the correct direction. Even though she typically fires with 2 weapons at once, her arms can aim independently from one another if need be to adjust to her target's position. She'll even make sure not to waste bullets if the target slips behind cover. But most of the time, the best way to approach enemy confrontations in Tomb Raider is to avoid enemy confrontations. Typically, you'll look for a safe ledge or doorway where the enemies can't reach you, and pluck away at their health with your infinite ammo pea shooters as they run around helpless to do anything. In instances where you can't just climb to safety, combat essentially boils down to holding down the fire button as you spam back and side flips like a coked-up jackrabbit to try and minimize the amount of damage taken. Many of the enemies in Tomb Raider are some sort of animal or creature, and they move in ways that can feel flat-out unfair in light of how rigid the player's movement is. Lara's moveset really isn't built to contend with enemies as agile as these. There are a handful of human enemies that return fire with weapons of their own, and again, there's no real way to elegantly deal with these enemies. Just hold down the fire button and spam health packs until they die. So, in the end, it's the levels themselves that really carry Tomb Raider's gameplay, not the combat. The game's 15 levels can get pretty beefy. Even the shortest level in the game can take around 10 minutes, and that's if you know what you're doing. The game's plot is split into 4 distinct chunks, or acts, that take place among 4 different locations. You begin in Peru, then Greece, then Egypt, and then finally the lost island of Atlantis. And once you clear the Peru levels and move on to Greece, the levels really start to step things up in terms of both length and density. The first Greek level, St. Francis's Folly, revolves around a large vertical central chamber that you have to descend and scale a few times over in order to open doors and solve its Greek god-themed puzzle rooms. Although the game uses the Roman name Neptune in place of the Greek name Poseidon, and Thor isn't a Greek god at all, he's Norse, but whatever. And a few levels later, you explore the massive palace Midas, complete with a statue of the eponymous king, and climbing into the statue's hand does exactly what you should expect. That's definitely one of the game's most creative deaths. Beating the game once allows you to replay any level with infinite ammo and all weapons available for a sort of pseudo-New Game Plus. So the game isn't lacking in interesting content, no doubt thanks to the custom level editor the team built when making the game, which allowed them to design and adjust large levels with ease. However, I'd be lying if I said those Greece levels didn't feel like they dragged a bit. With the shift from Peru to Greece, the levels start to nearly double in length, some taking upwards of an hour or 2 unless you really know the layouts. Greece also takes a bigger share of the overall level total than the other locations. Greece has 5 levels, while the other locations have only 3 or 4. While there weren't any levels that I thought felt unbearably awful or anything, I wouldn't have complained if they chopped some of this down. Like, the cistern could probably be cut, if you ask me, especially since that level contains some of the game's biggest frame rate drops. And for those 5 levels, you're also dealing with Pierre, a recurring human enemy character who shows up unexpectedly throughout to try to kill Lara, which can really make these already lengthy levels feel like that much more of a hassle. Tomb Raider is never boring in terms of scenery, though. The designers did research into the real-life art and architecture of the cultures they were representing. Well, I mean, not Atlantis, obviously, but you know. Which really helps in grounding the entire game with a sense of realism that makes it easier to swallow some of the fantasy elements that show up later. And we weren't yet at the era in the industry where realism in video games just meant making everything brown. There's still plenty of color and life in these abandoned lands, and there's an honest sense of wonder and discovery to every location. The team realized early on that the PlayStation tech couldn't really pull off the grand outdoor environments they were hoping for, and so every location Lara visits is implied to inexplicably be located underground somehow, but that combined with the threatening wildlife lurking about actually helps give the game a sort of survival horror vibe at times. After the first few levels of the game have you mostly fighting off wolves, bats, and an occasional bear, imagine the absolute shock when you stumble into a hidden underground valley in level 3 and a frickin' T-Rex shows up as you're trying to outrun a pair of velociraptors. True, you can just run into a nearby cave to a high ledge and slowly chip away at the Rex with your pea shooters while it harmlessly stomps back and forth, but before you figure that out, that first encounter with the Rex can be heart-pounding. The CG cutscenes are, well, they're early PS1 CG cutscenes, so not great. They're relics of their time. Because archaeology. But the rest of the game looks great. Graphics can occasionally suffer from flickering issues with certain assets, like some save crystals seem to be practically invisible until you're right in front of them, but the actual visual design of the game is top-notch for the era. Atlantis was a real standout just for how much it went against my expectations. When you think of Atlantis, you tend to imagine some Aquaman or Little Mermaid type deal. Blues, greens, and yellows with a lot of ocean-themed visuals. But Tomb Raider's version of Atlantis almost looks like it's made out of pure flesh and muscle, with a lot of pinks, tans, and reds, with the various surfaces veined and pulsing as though you're inside a living creature. The Atlantean enemies you fight also stick to this aesthetic, seeming to lack any skin, making the game's climax feel constantly visceral and unsettling, and adding to those survival horror vibes. Lara's movements are also very fluidly animated. With Tomb Raider being a third-person game, the devs knew you'd be spending a lot of time looking at your character, and so they put a lot of care into making every action she performs look dynamic. They chose to forego motion capture in favor of animating everything by hand, since the early motion capture of the day couldn't really capture smooth or seamless movement the way it can now. The developers even added these little flourishes to Lara's moveset that don't serve any mechanical purpose and are just there to look cool, such as a swan dive or this fancy handstand you can do when pulling onto ledges. Lara is also fully voiced, not just in cutscenes but also during gameplay, with various grunts and groans as she jumps, climbs, pushes, and pulls her way through each environment. Her voice was provided by English actress Shelley Blond, who was cast after the team spent 6 months looking for the right sound for the character. Blond was directed to perform Lara's lines with a sort of flat James Bond-esque delivery, and this really lends to the sort of effortlessly cool aura that Lara Croft is meant to embody. One interesting artistic choice the team at Core Design made with Tomb Raider was to keep music very minimal, which no doubt is going to make my job harder when it comes time to edit this video, but it definitely was the right choice to set the sort of atmosphere the game was going for. Music cues are reserved almost exclusively as stingers for establishing shots of new and interesting landmarks, or for tense moments, such as sudden or dangerous enemy encounters. Most of the time, though, the levels are in total silence, aside from Lara's own exclamations and some occasional environmental noises. The music was reportedly created on a very tight schedule, with tracks often being written without any idea of when or how they would be used in-game, and all of the tracks included in the final game were the first recordings, since there was apparently no time for any rewrites. And it's stories like those that remind me that the original Tomb Raider was not some massive AAA project backed by a large budget or the unlimited resources of a major publisher. It was a fairly quaint labor of love by a small team of programmers, designers, and artists who just really wanted to make an action-adventure game. They were based in a small office in England working with custom-built game engines, because this was years before Unreal Engine and almost a decade before Unity. The entire dev team for this game was a half-dozen people. Look at the credits. That's it. Just this one screen that pops up at the end of the game with 6 names on it. And remembering the relatively small scale of this project makes it so much cooler that this game became what it is now. Core Design may not be involved in the Tomb Raider games past 2003 or so, and the company itself has been defunct for close to 15 years now, but the long-lasting success of the franchise will always be a part of their legacy and their mark on the gaming industry. When you really stop and look around at the games that have come out since Tomb Raider, you really start to see its fingerprints, even today. There are so many action-adventure games that would be very different, or perhaps wouldn't even exist without Tomb Raider paving the way. Safe to say, games like Uncharted and Assassin's Creed owe much to Lara Croft, and I'd wager to say games like Shadow of the Colossus took at least some level of influence from what Core made back in 1996. Hell, I'd even be willing to bet that Nintendo looked at Tomb Raider as a blueprint when they were making games like Ocarina of Time. Dark Souls and games of its ilk also seem to have a fairly similar gameplay loop, where limited save points and a high density of deadly hurdles to overcome can often mean repeating lengthy segments of gameplay over and over again until you finally do everything just right. And just as Tomb Raider took influence from the original Prince of Persia games, no doubt the Prince of Persia reboots borrowed from Tomb Raider in return. I of course can't claim that third-person 3D action games as a genre wouldn't exist without Tomb Raider, but I can safely theorize that the landscape would likely look very different without Tomb Raider setting the example. And to bring back that old Tomb Raider versus Mario 64 discussion of yesteryear, I'd actually argue that, in the grand scheme of things, Tomb Raider has probably proved to be the more important game in the long run. Don't get me wrong, Mario 64 is great, but when you think about the type of big-budget games that become popular within the modern gaming community, would you say those games have more in common with Mario 64 or with Tomb Raider? And even when played in the modern day, the early 3D quirks of this first game become an almost intrinsic part of the experience, something that you learn to adjust to and accommodate for. And once you understand the specific rules the game abides by, it makes everything click that much more once you practice enough to get really good at it. I mean, except for the way Lara needs to be standing directly on top of an item before she'll grab it. That never stopped being annoying. Tomb Raider, much like the artifacts Lara Croft ventures to uncover, shows its age, but it still shines with a beauty that reminds us of how very important it ultimately proved to be. Oh, also, I have a notes app on my phone where I just write down random thoughts I have about certain games so that when it comes time for me to write about them, I can use some of those thoughts. And there's one note that I've had in my app for a year, and I have no idea, why I wrote this down. But here it is. Here's the note. It says, Tomb Raider, Tom Raider. That's it. I don't know why I wrote it down. I don't know why I thought of that. I don't know why I thought it was funny enough to write down. Apparently, I got a real kick out of it because it's just been sitting there. It needed to be in the video, but what do I do with that? Tom Raider. There you go. It's a little pun. Yeah.